Okay, so hopefully this is working. Just to get started, so this is Allison McDowell. I'm here with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. Up in our office, we host monthly get-togethers to talk about radical social work and the issues with the nonprofit industrial complex. And I have the honor of being here to talk a little bit today. I think maybe later Sherry was going to talk about the opioid crisis in the city of Philadelphia, and I'm going to go over a little bit aspects of how that plays into other profit centers beyond the pushing of these prescription opioids onto people and the treatment, but there's actually financialization and social control elements involved that I'm going to go into. So just to start off with, for those, I know some of you all are more familiar than others, but with the issue of why is this happening, and we spoke about it a little bit earlier, but it's not that folks don't know better, it's that they actually have to come up with new markets in human capital to run global capital through. Like as we have increased numbers of poor folks and a concentration of wealth, and we're looking at a coming fourth industrial revolution of further automation where people are supposed to work with robots before the robots take over, and we have these public-private partnerships that are ushering all of this in. This is all coming in with bipartisan support. How does capital continue to flow in that circumstance? So you have poor folks with not any money, you have wealthy folks with all the money, and essentially for the rich, what they need to do is partner with the government and nonprofits to create infrastructures, I almost equate it to a plumbing problem, to flow their capital through the bodies of the poor, the global poor. And many of these financial instruments that I'm going to be talking about were actually refined through global aid systems. And so they've pushed it through State Department, also through the UK aid development systems, and so they were refined in, global South countries, and then now they're being brought back to being applied to the poor within the confines of U.S. empire domestically. So that's
at some point. I think that the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign should write a book that could give concrete examples on how everything you just said is true.
You guys live it. I mean, that's why we're together, right? I follow the money. I see it on the paper. You guys have the lived experience, and that's, I think, where the power comes in. Is like
flown to aid stuff all over the world.
Right. So they have to model it, and they have to make it palatable, right? We're helping people. We're just helping them. Just here, let me make sure that you have your unique identifier so we can track our impact.
You get free bags and everything.
So just in case this seems a little over the top, this is actually a publication out of the Federal Reserve publication on these human capital performance bonds. And for a long time, I thought that the origins were more like in the early 2000s. This is actually in the mid-1990s. Stephen Rothschild was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and he refined sort of a work-ready program, training program, and he was doing the first outcomes-based contracting in Minnesota and got the infrastructure for this all ready. And so this is actually, he and Art Rolnick with the Minneapolis Federal Reserve sort of refined this idea of outcomes-based government contracting tied to human performance and behavior. So this was, in a more traditional sense, a work-based program that Rothschild came up with. I don't know if it was like returning citizens or someone like getting them into under unemployed folks into work, adult men. But clearly this idea of capital performance is now being applied broadly from everything from like preschool children to people who have issues with addiction to people with chronic illness. Like how you perform your behavior within sort of the state of empire is really important, and this is the infrastructure. So just Federal Reserve publication there, that's real. So what this system requires, and this is what I try to emphasize, is that if you're going to create a global market in human capital that relies on people being broken and relies on poverty, you're never going to eliminate the source of your profit. You will manage it. You will manage it as profitably as possible. But you cannot create global markets in poverty management and expect that someday poverty will stop. It's just not logical. So what we need is lots of people broken to be processed through these increasingly technologized systems and tied to these outcomes-based government contracts, which for a time were called social impact bonds. Now they've been called pay for success, or sometimes like social impact partnerships. So you'll hear a lot of these different words, but essentially the idea is that the government outsources and privatizes what it should be doing for people to private sector entities, many of which are nonprofits or faith-based entities. And then they are supposedly issuing these services tied to payments conditioned on the fact that the people that they're managing do what they're supposed to do, according to what global finance wants. So this is an infographic that I developed sort of pointing out all of these different impact opportunities. So it's way more than workforce development. Right now they're actually pushing home visits for poor moms, and again, getting their properly compliant pregnancy behaviors. And again, I'm all for women getting access to quality maternal health care. It should, well, I mean, people say, how can you be against home visits? Well, if what they're going to do is hand you an app to track your behavior called Goal Mama, which Pierre Omidyar's wife from Hope Lab developed and piloted in South Carolina, which at this point is voluntary, but how long is it before they track how you interact with their recommended content, who's in your social network, in your maternal care group, how often you check your texts and reply? If you start to become rated at the point that you go to deliver your baby, at some future point, it's not beyond expectation that they might not let you take your kid home.
Simultaneously, do they give you another app that tracks whether or not they did delivery of service?
Well, so that's another piece. Okay. Well,
no.
Well, so it's interesting. Yeah, a lot of it is on the compliance of the person, not the system.
Yeah.
So again,
that's why I'm being sarcastic.
Yes. So yeah, well, this whole point is that these neoliberal systems then push the burden of compliance as if you just did all the right things, you as an individual person would be fine.
If you only utilize city services.
Not looking at the structural underpinnings that it is broken on purpose, and that these infrastructures are predicated in large part on structural racism and other classism and other elements that are intended to keep people poor, even if they follow all the rules. So this infographic touches on these different impact areas, from prenatal health care, early childhood education. I have some blog posts about surveillance play tables where they're looking at social behaviors, and that's the impact metric. They're figuring out how to tie SNAP and nutrition access into these metrics, like, oh, you'll be healthier if you get food, right? But we'll track it. We'll track your caloric intake, and we'll track your chronic health impacts, and that's your justification for having access to food. Supportive housing is a huge one that I'm writing about. Affordable housing is being set up as a pay-for-success financial infrastructure. The cost offsets being your future as being incarcerated, or your future being addicted, or your future having diabetes. Like, they will give you housing if, based on your predictive analytics, we can offset the cost of you having to service you in the future in all these different ways, which is sick, but that's what capitalism is. That's where we've gotten. So literacy, character training, workforce training, chronic health, behavioral health, mental health issues, addiction, and then also reskilling in the workforce. So that's the piece of this we have to understand is within the fourth industrial revolution, this idea is we're going to have very precarious labor. Everyone is going to be on demand, just-in-time labor force. They don't want you to really think too much about it. They just want to train you for what they need you to do for the next 2 years, so they can push you out and reskill you for the thing for the 2 years after that. And so, but they don't want you to actually think about it enough that you might actually revolt against that system, that you should just comply. And that's what this shift in education that's happening now towards blockchain credentials and reskilling. They don't actually want you to go to school. They just want you to have lifelong learning and earning, that you're always just doing what they say and getting credit on the blockchain for what you've done. But it all has to be within their system. They don't want you to think outside the system. So, and this is the thing. So we need these people to be fixed, but will everyone be fixed? Who's the attractive business opportunity? And I think my experience with charter schools and understanding the ways in which people cream certain populations to make their numbers look good is very relevant, is that the people that they're looking for are not people who are extremely broken and really don't have much hope at being fixed according to the standards of success that are set by the deal. They don't want really broken people that don't have a lot of growth potential. They don't really want people who are a little bit bad, but their situation is, but not terrible. They're okay. They might improve a little bit. Well, they want people who can jump, right? So they want someone who's in very bad circumstances, but they predict will do really well with limited cost intervention. because that's the sweet spot for them with these outcomes contracts is they need to identify those people, and increasingly that will be done through predictive analytics, and analytics not just in your data that you're generating through your purchase patterns or your involvement in social welfare systems or judicial systems, but also like your zip code that you live, like what kind of email service provider you have, like potentially even genomic data might be filtered into that at some future point. So I think
genomic, that's your genes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are elements within the social impact sphere that actually have ties to Ancestry.com DNA. And this Chan Zuckerberg Hausler interoperable database system that was rolling out. David Hausler was at the launch for it, the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust, and he was the guy who put the DNA sequencing on the internet. So why they had David Hausler at this panel about interoperable data for children is really interesting to me. Like, why was he invited? I have not gotten clarity on that. But I think that ultimately, if they can, this is a larger eugenics project that genomic data will be built in.
Well, I'll go see Will Smith after this.
So there are many companies now that are developing data dashboard systems for social welfare. It's all about big data, and it's all claimed to like, well, we just need to do as much as we can with this little amount of money, and we need to be very accountable. And so these issues of big data, data analytics are enabled by lean production, and there's also bipartisan support for accountability, that people can be reduced to data and that's okay. Like, that's a way of managing your resources.
I had told you before one time that I had a friend that lived on the next block, that her job was to study the psychology of different websites for the Republican Party, and then based on that data give input on
yeah, no, but I think it's really important to think that a lot of this is based in like very specific psychologies of digital and ways in which people can be manipulated through digital technologies and digital media. What's included, what's left out, how you interface with it, that these are all structured in very systematic ways, a lot of it emerging out of the military's work with technology.
I would say the military, but don't you think also connected to that would be elections? I think that there's stuff that we don't know right now where they're having to do all these major predictives, right?
They're trying to control. Well, that's the other piece is looking at social science and behavioral science. These global interests are trying to predict, because we're moving into very volatile times, like environmentally volatile, economically volatile, politically volatile. Like, it's just really challenging everywhere. You could just watch the news and see all of the unrest. They're trying to keep the lid on that pot. And so DARPA has actually funded, or it's not DARPA, maybe it's Department of Defense, the Minerva initiative of looking at social science to make these predictions. And then also DARPA is working on Narrative Network project to look at media and how media can be used predictively. And some of the stuff with Cambridge Analytica was built into that as well. And the Center for the Future of War is at Arizona State University. And it's largely funded with Google money. Eric Schmidt is like the major funder of the Center for the Future of War. But they have 3 sections that they're focused on: autonomous weapons, drones, and weaponized narrative. So we really are in this moment of like fighting for clarity of what's
narrative.
Yeah, weaponized narrative. So propaganda, like their framing is that the radicals are out there radicalizing people
like
against
drive. Like a war, before you have a war, you have a war drive. Mm-hmm. That prepares you for the war.
Yeah. And that we're almost like in constant war. I mean, a war drive. Yeah, war drive. Okay, so this is well, I think that's the larger point, is that there's a war being carried on against the poor right now.
And that's why it's so important to use that incorporate that language.
Yeah.
I was at a
because this is really awesome. But my feedback would be to incorporate that.
Okay.
Because it is what it is. I mean, this makes it palatable.
I know.
You understand what I'm
No,
saying?
you need something to cut through.
You're the way you talk about, I mean, you're sounding the alarm.
We need something a little more emphatic.
Yeah, like I read one of my poems at a tribute for Amiri Baraka two weeks ago, and I'm from Newark, New Jersey. He's from Newark, New Jersey, and I talked about the fact that the United States was at war in Vietnam, and during the same years they invaded hundreds of cities throughout the United States. You know, the military, and Newark, New Jersey was one of those cities. And there was a rebellion, and the armed forces, tanks, and everything was called out to invade hundreds of cities in this country during the Vietnam War. And the issue was police brutality. And Amiri Baraka, a few months before the rebellion erupted, he was brutalized by the police. You see, so this was something that was routine. That you have the Civil Rights Act in the mid 1960s, and the government immediately violates its own laws. Right. You see, and brutalizes people and has all kinds of discrimination that's in violation not only of the Civil Rights Act but the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and all kinds of other laws. And so there's a rebellion against that, and then they bring in the armed forces, you know, in the middle of the war, to go to war against people in the United States. So, and they say, oh, this was a riot. People were breaking the law when they were breaking the law.
Well, it's interesting. So now we have smart cities. We have this technology, and a couple weeks ago there was a open records request that it revealed that ICE was contracting for simulations, high level simulations of urban warfare, a Chicago model and an Arizona model. So these digital virtual world simulations were like on contract offers out for these RFPs for these simulators. And then I found some reports from TRADOC about urbanized warfare in megacities. So I think as we understand these technological systems, we're operating in a globalized world in which these systems will be equally applied within our own borders. Very likely, there's nothing to stop that. We're and controlling that narrative leading up to that is really is what they're trying to do. And so we have different kinds we have very extreme things, which could be autonomous weaponized drones, and then we have like the soft policing. So we have the policing that, we saw in the urban warfare in the 60s, but then we have the soft policing of the social welfare state. And that's something that I'm trying to emphasize, is that not the individual people who are in the system are individually, like they're probably all like got into it. People don't get into this work for the pay. They would do it because they want to help people, but they don't necessarily know what they're going to be tapped to do once they're in the system. And so how do we work with people to open their eyes to the soft policing piece? So the software increasingly, so what I came to this through public education and understanding through ed tech, teachers were being dehumanized, those relationships between teachers and students, and being pushed into data. So then teachers were supposed to spend their time on a dashboard looking at students as data, not as human beings, and developing relationships. Well, the same is happening in the social work sphere. So, but all of this data is going to be used to feed these financial instruments. So it's not only dehumanizing and limiting in terms of the options that are going to be available to people, but the software companies are making out like bandits, and this is going to be what underpins the financial piece of the trading of these outcomes-based contracts. So this is just from one of my little videos, but it's an image that shows like that people are tied to and it may be unwillingly. I mean, I've mentioned things that are happening with Fitbits and tracking, and people say, well, why would people do that? And I'm like, it's not going to be their choice. They're going to need public assistance, and that's going to be the option. Either you're on the street in the elements, or if you want to get access to help, it's going to be conditioned on having your data poured into these contracting systems. And this is going to come somewhat through screen-based, and most social workers or healthcare providers all have the tablets, and they're all, come into your house, and they first, like, even if you go to the dentist, they want to like put a whole bunch of information in. Like, you have to. If you don't get service.
You get all the phones. You get the free phones. everybody
Yeah.
gets the free phones so that
They can track, yeah. They say, did you sleep between these hours of the day? But the data is currency, and it's not just screens, it's going to be wearable tech. So, okay, so I don't have the internet here, but this is a screenshot of a video, and I'll send it around with the link. It says, meet Kathy. So Kathy is a social worker. She's part of a regional hub of health-centric opportunities, and Kathy is helping Joe, who just got out of prison, transition. But she said that Joe will do much better if his wife and daughter are also doing better. So that now the whole family is on these pathway intervention plans that are, again, not by choice. And so people who aren't even judicially involved, which we know has its own issues, but the child has asthma and the mom smokes. So then all of a sudden, the whole family is engaged in sort of compliant tracking behavior. That's not to say like maybe the people live in environmentally terrible areas with air quality, that's the asthma problem, but that the social worker is going to start to get like paid based on if the people they're working with, this whole family, does what it's supposed to and does these various checks, which are now going to be connected to data, and there are payment systems. So in the UK, where this is the social impact bond model is much more further developed, they call the social workers navigators. I don't know if that's in common use here, but this idea that you will have a navigator to set you on this pathway. It's very gamified, and these pathways have different points of like you achieve different levels up of compliance and behavior. The way it's set up in the UK, the St. Mungo Sib, there's a really good multi-part essay, and I can link to it, about the problems with how this social impact bond is set up for unhoused folks in London. But essentially, for it to work, these people have to leave London. But their social workers are based in London. Now their client base is all scattered in the outer areas of London because there's no good place to live. And then the social workers are positioned as almost free agents, like independent contractors, trying to get all of their people managed to do the things that they're supposed to do. So not only is it harming the people who are getting services, it's harming the worker who's also being put in this position increasingly as their own sort of freelance subject, trying to manage these contractual arrangements that are essentially impossible. So what's on the right of this slide is from the Meet Kathy. This is just like a follow-up, couple images. One, this is Kathy putting people on the pathways, 1, 2, 3, 4, housing, employment, behavioral health, and medical, home. And then there's like a across the finish line with a dollar sign. So Kathy's going to get paid when all the people in that family are doing their things connected to what she told them to do with the pathway. But Kathy may not even be able to really have much choice about the pathway. The pathway may just be set by some computer program. Like, oh, if you meet these criteria, this is your pathway. And I think it's really important to note that housing is the first one, because I think we can all agree that housing is a crucial human need. But the housing first policy, essentially then your supportive housing, once you have housing, then you can be managed within these systems. And so we have to be able to disconnect and talk about people's right to shelter and housing aside from them being managed as data commodities. And I think that's really important to start having that conversation, because we're being trained to only talk about affordable housing, but not talk about the things that are going to be layered on top of once you have housing. These things will be done to you so that Kathy can get her dollar sign payment when you cross the finish line.
Well, that's why they had to develop the term housing ready. That came in the last decade, because they never used that before. When you were homeless and you needed affordable housing, you were homeless and you needed affordable housing. And now they use the term you have to be housing ready before you get affordable housing. So you have to meet all this criteria.
Well, that's been for a while, yeah.
Yeah. For at least a decade now.
Yeah.
Well, and it may be flipping to now housing first. Like, I wonder if that's the lead-in. So now that they can say, oh, you don't have to be housing ready, because now our new profit model is we'll get you in housing, and then we'll make our money off of you once we get you in housing, because it's conditioned on these other crossing the line pathway programs. So, and this sort of goes back to the sort of the militarized policing, is that I think we do need to understand that this is really about risk scoring people and predictively profiling people, and that it's all happening with an increasingly surveillance state. That are these smart technologies that are really obvious through facial recognition cameras and various other elements. But we're a smart city. Philadelphia is one. Like, we're going to be seeing, smart light posts, much more surveillance. I don't know if you've seen the like digital billboards that are downtown now. Mm-hmm. They're like freestanding kiosks, and they have ads, but you can make some phone calls and you can plug your phone into them. So many folks who are out on the streets are charging their phones on these kiosks. And the ones that Google has in New York, and I think they're the same here, once you charge your phone on it, there's a tracker on your phone and it will ping you against any other one that you're near. So it starts to build overlays of data around usage. But when people are on the streets, like that's really their only option because their life lives on their phone. Like they need to have that phone charged. And so these smart infrastructures are coming in, and in many ways they're like, oh, that's kind of annoying billboard, but you don't really think about it in a more deep way. But these networks, Palantir is Peter Thiel's company. He owns PayPal. He's a super scary guy. They do predictive policing. They work with Customs and Border Security. They do a lot of really intense, I think they came out of In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm. They're actually running the data for the homeless social impact bond in Santa Clara County, California. So now if you're an unhoused person, your data is running through Palantir if you get those services. And people are not stopping to think about the ethics of what that means. I mean, it's really pretty intense.
Oh
I mean,
It's not sad anymore.
right? And then increasingly the other piece of this is that machine learning is being run on social work records to make predictions about future child abuse or other things where social workers are being disempowered. So the way teachers, AI is being used to say, like, the AI knows what you need to know next better than your teacher. And so we're pushing these systems. But if you consider, as we mediate our interactions through text online, and a lot of therapy now is teletherapy, text therapy, they can run machine learning on all that data and start, one, creating better AI, but two, making larger systems predictions about the world, about you as an individual, and then like, oh, maybe we're going to run all the data analytics on the teletherapy patients in London, and like, we'll have a pretty good bead. Like, maybe we know the people in London are going to revolt a week before they even think about it. Like, because we're running all of that data. So it's both disempowering the person who's facilitating it, although they're the front for this system, and then it's pretty intense, but these things are happening. This is the Machine Learning Center in the UK, and I know people have been fighting back against racially biased algorithms, but it's even bigger. Yeah, sure.
For me, when I was in college and I took Latin American studies, there was a yellow book, and I wish to God I remembered the yellow book, what it was. But it was the first time I had read about, because of U.S. exceptionalism, right? I mean, things are always horrifying all over the world, even though we live in the belly of the beast, right?
Yeah.
So because, I've been a single mother on welfare and homeless in my life, while I'm reading this yellow book on, all these warfare, CIA intelligence stuff that, that they conducted, and dictatorships in Latin America, I'm like reading this like a novel of everything that's like happening here. You know what I mean?
Right.
As I'm, learning about, because I was young and I was learning about the mothers of the disappeared, and there was an entire section that talked about how they didn't go after the leader. They broke the leader, the women, by going after everybody else that was around. And going after their children.
Yeah, no, that's...
And so for me, a lot of this stuff, which hasn't even been discussed in circles and conversations, is absolutely crucial. Because when we talk about like COINTELPRO, and we talk about just this new layer of horrifying stuff that's happening to anybody that's doing any kind of organizing.
Yeah.
Radical we're not organizing. Having those conversations, you know what I mean?
Well, and that the women, that's true, because when I was reading one of the Harriet Tubman books, and they were talking about that it was much harder for women to leave, because leaving, it meant like you have multiple children, and how can you bring everyone, and that challenge. And so that I think in many ways, not exclusively, but targeting families and looking at family networks as ways of keeping people in line. It's really real, and it's happening. So I'm just going to jump ahead. So this is a report, and I can link to this, but it was from 2010. So like we're going on almost 10 years now out of Harvard, that it's essentially about sort of the future data analytics model for social welfare state and how you get these values out of it. And Harvard is so evil. But they were talking about, like, it really is, the more you realize it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like why? But like all of these policies. So in many respects, like Harvard Kennedy School does the policy and then MIT does the tech. And so a lot of this is really centered in Boston venture capital, which it wasn't until I sort of dove into this that I realized that much of Boston venture capital, which is global venture capital, was built on commodifying the military research technology out of the Second World War. And that's what largely built sort of the venture capital system. And that's why it's so embedded. Like, it's definitely Silicon Valley as well and New York hedge funds, but there's a really, really dark side to Boston and what's happening there. But so this came out of Harvard, but they were talking about data analytics of the NYPD and the sensors and effective, like, I'll just read this one line. Based on the analysis of family and social patterns, for example, a parent being incarcerated, researchers are able to effectively predict future challenges and opportunities for the family as well as resources. So I think if we layer that with the video of Meet Kathy, it's like they're predictively profiling people. Like if they say that's your future and you're a poor person who doesn't have a support network, it doesn't matter if that isn't your future. If they say it is, with the legitimacy of all of this data, like it's very hard to fight that and say, like, I wasn't ever going to be incarcerated, like, or I wasn't ever going to have that happen to me. They've already decided. It's like it's this almost pre-crime situation, and it's very hard to extract yourself from it. So the opioid. So how does this come to the opioid stuff? I think a lot of folks are familiar with the profit model of the Sacklers and the sale of that, both the legal drug sale and then the illicit sales of the opioids. And I think we understand too about the paid treatment programs or the industry that has arisen around treating. And again, I think in many respects we need to consider the opioid crisis within the context of surplus labor. We have all these people. We don't really need them economically. What do we do with these people?
Good stuff here, Allison.
But like what do we do? So maybe some of them they die of this stuff. They kill each other. There's violence. They're incapacitated. But it's their fault. It's not that we don't have a good job for them if they didn't make bad choices. That they can maintain this illusion. But there's whole swaths of cities that have been rendered like unavailable were their labor. It is also very convenient. So I think we need to think about this as a surplus labor issue.
I was working in one of the last factories in Philadelphia, the Bud Company on Hunting Park Avenue, just about five minutes from here. And I was making about $20 an hour, at the time. So they had an article in the Daily News, about how much money does a drug dealer make. Mm-hmm. The average drug dealer is not making a lot of money, and I'm looking at these numbers, and it was equivalent to what I was making, in the factory, So,
yeah.
so I'm saying, well, these jobs that I'm doing, they're leaving the city, and these other jobs are coming in. So something's happening here.
You have to write that article.
Yeah, I know. We used to be the workshop of the world. Well, the interesting thing too, like on the factories, I'm not sure. Is the Bud factory? Is that in? Is
Honey
north?
Park,
what?
right over here.
Oh, honey. Yeah. So the Kroc Center is across from the SEPTA yard,
that's
right there.
That used to be the Bud Company.
Yeah. So do you know about Friedrich Taylor, like Taylorism?
Yeah.
Like
the
lean. That's
I
where.
read, that was Monthly Review Press.
That was his where he did his research.
Well, he
was the
did
SEPTA.
Midvale. Midvale Steel was right next door.
Yeah. Well, but that area, which is it's just really fascinating. Like, what would Friedrich Taylor do with tesserae and mosaic from DARPA, right?
Taylor was the mentor to Henry Ford.
Of course he was. Okay. See, we're sort of post-Fordist, essentially.
And another thing about Taylor is that's interesting with respect to him and Ford is that W.E.B. Du Bois sat down with Frederick Taylor because Taylor was transforming the factory from a skilled job into a much more repetitive type thing. And nobody wanted to do this work, so he would get black people to come in.
That's why it was in a...
See.
Okay.
So Du Bois had meetings with him, you know, where he said, okay, this is how we're going to advance, you know. And Henry Ford had arrangements with black churches in Detroit, where they would Henry Ford would hire people through the church, you know, and he would give money to the church, you know, as a buffer between him and the union in order to organize those factories.
And it's very de-skilled and interchangeable labor.
They had to make it clear that they were going to fight against discrimination, because otherwise, Henry Ford was already giving people jobs. They were horrendous jobs, but it was better than what they had before, you know. And that's the history.
Wow,
you know.
I know. I think I'm supposed to do this stuff. I keep thinking, like, I just drive by the Taylor, you know, Midvale. There are these layers of history, and if you don't understand the history, like, the future has to mesh with the history because it cycles, and it's all building on the same thing.
Huberman and Sweezy, they were labor and monopoly capital.
Okay.
Like they talked about Taylor.
Yeah, I need to look more. So the opioid crisis. So this was going on for a while. This is a report from 2016, deploying the pay for success model to help address the opioid epidemic in the U.S. So this is a White House paper from 2016. This is the Obama White House. So this is the new profit sector, is linking pay for success to the opioid epidemic. And I think in many respects, what is likely to happen is that it will go hand in hand with supportive housing ultimately, and that there will be layers of processing people through housing and systems. But again, is it to eliminate this crisis and get people fully clean, or is it to manage them in an ongoing way so the finance matrix keeps going? And I think it's the latter. But it's very clear from the top that pay for success was baked in to the managing opioids, and it's kind of unclear from that little box, but you can see the arrow. Pay for Success Opioid Research Source Guide. So one of them was at the top, it's judicial involvement, and the other one is opioid. So these are these key pieces. There's Obama, like Office of Social Innovation, that their social innovation is to make money off of poor people's misery. So again, we have to consider that the sales, the treatment, the finance of the treatment, these wraparound services, the supportive housing, how that factors in, and then the financing of all of these services. And so all of these are finance mechanisms that depend on people being in conditions of need and dependency on the welfare system, even with all of the conditions that are imposed. So this is a recent project that touches a little bit on how global capital, that this isn't just a U.S. problem, that really we are operating at the behest of transnational global capital, many of which the major players are U.S. interests, but not exclusively. So there was a Pay for Success project in Connecticut that was set up a couple years ago. It was an early stage process. I think Dave Wilkinson, who was head of the Social Innovation Fund for Obama, is now head of early childhood in Connecticut. So he's over in Connecticut setting things up. The conditions of being involved in this project were that you were involved in like child welfare, something that had come up in terms of mistreatment of child, and that you had substance use issues. And so these were these families. And again, when we talk about, if we understand that the value proposition is in the data and then the control of individuals, it's much better from a financial standpoint to control a whole family than it is to control one person. So while there's a certain amount of money to be made on like the individual single guy on the street,
it's much more lucrative.
Like he's only one. If you can get into a family, that's a lot more data and a lot more interventions that you can impose. So this is sort of a gold mine. Is like you've got a family, there's kids, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which got its start. There are multiple Casey Foundation elements, but they're really behind the human capital impact investing. They're based in Baltimore, but originally started in Seattle as like a courier service, and then is essentially UPS, like evolved. The Caseys run UPS, and many UPS interests are on the Casey board. But it was around foster care. So their charitable enterprise in the 50s and 60s was foster care in Seattle that moved to Connecticut and is now in Baltimore. But the Casey family is very much enmeshed in this, and they are doing this 2-generation approach to impact investing in families. So it's important to understand the family piece of this. There's a Philadelphia connection to Connecticut in that one of the funders for this project is the Reinvestment Fund, which is based here. So they have this $10 million, which isn't really very big. Like, they're still putting their toe in the water on this. But this Pay for Success Fund is announced with the Reinvestment Fund. The Reinvestment Fund is also involved with this Welcome Home Housing Social Impact Bond in Santa Clara. So that was done under Jeremy Nowak when he was still alive. So that's the one with Palantir, right? So the Reinvestment Fund, even though it's based here, has these tentacles reaching in various directions around welfare. One is housing. This is this opioid intervention. They also are paired with QBE insurance. So if you think of pots of capital that have to move, right? You have some rich guys, right? You have the Bezoses and the Gates, but then you also have these, the big foundations, the Rockefeller and the Ford foundations to move their money. You have religious faith-based groups. You have the Vatican Bank. You have LDS. You have mega churches. You have, but you also have pension funds. Right? You have insurance premium funds. There are all of these pots of capital. Well, one of the pots of capital that was investing in this program was QBE Insurance. So we have to also think about the insurance companies. So this is an Australian insurance company investing in a bond in Connecticut on intervening in these families in Connecticut. The other one was BNP Paribas Bank, which is a French bank. So there's U.S. money pouring into this intervention, but there's also from 2 countries that have nothing to do, very far away from Connecticut, but they're banking on this intervention in these families. So you have these families, but they're like pawns in this game of French banks and Australian insurance companies. It's very muddy, and people have no idea. Yes.
Unless you live next to Kensington and Allegheny, in which they just opened a new massive clinic in the old bank that couldn't survived the Great Depression, and inside the clinic is a bank and an insurance.
Interesting.
In a hospital.
And it's in the clinic.
A clinic. Well, that's the new thing that they have. These
yes.
little
No.
Emergency room.
It's a faith-based bank.
Interesting. Well, so I need some legal, people to look into the legal stuff, because there's some loophole that was put in the mid-90s that Bill Clinton signed around SEC's regulation of debt issued by faith-based communities and nonprofits. That they loop around and somehow they're exempt from certain oversight. And then this also relates to Utah, because I think there are 4 states that have industrial banking laws. So there are these alternate kinds of banks that don't do commercial banking, they wouldn't do a checking account for John Smith. They just deal in larger commercial transactions, which I think are going to be the basis for these human capital finance pieces. But the fact that faith-based debt and nonprofit debt can be issued in ways that might obscure full clarity about what's going on with those debt issuances, I think is really key. And I don't have the legal understanding to really tease it out and look at that law, understanding security law. But if anybody knows anybody, I think that's a critical piece, because one of the things, these Pay for Success bonds still have the government involved. The government outsources to a nonprofit on negotiated terms for these success outcomes, and then the nonprofit gets investors that invest in them. But there's still a government that is ultimately the provider. They are developing new ones that are called impact securities that don't have the government at all. A nonprofit issues a debt, and an investor comes in, and they're repaid by a foundation if they meet their terms. So imagine if, you have some sort of evidence-based addiction intervention that is tied into data and Fitbits and biometric monitoring, and Hewlett-Packard, the company, invests, and William and Flora Hewlett Foundation is the payee, and they can just launder their money through these systems. Microsoft and Gates Foundation, Dell and the Dell Foundation. These big tech companies have investor arms and philanthropy arms. So they can use it as a wash, but then control the people as data in between. So anyway, that's getting a little bit off track. But this slide shows that BNP Paribas and QBE Bank, and they're talking about creative financing solutions, because all of this is predicated on austerity and the fact that corporations are not paying into the taxes, and that the tax burden is increasingly on the working class, and like all the tax stuff is like held offshore, so that there is no public money. It all has to be private, and the private is predicated on tying people into these impact investments. So the Urban Institute is a big part of this. For this project, the success, so they get to screen for success. Like, they get to decide, and they're not going to pick a success metric that's hard, right? Because they want to win. So it was clean screens, reduced reports of mistreatment, and reduced foster care placement. And so what would happen is that this evidence-based intervention, which came out of the Yale Child Study Center, because all of this is like given the stamp of approval by esteemed institutions of higher education, like, yay, it's out of Yale, it must be like really good for people. The reality is that the families that were impacted were mostly like single mom families that were existing on under $700 a month. So these are families that are like under $10,000 a year with children, like in Connecticut, which is not a cheap real estate market, to try to get by. They didn't actually fix the economics of their situation. They just monitored multiple times a week to come into their home and do this work and apply this treatment that didn't actually fundamentally remedy the fact that maybe they were self-medicating because there was no other way to get through their day because they're trying to get by on no money to support their family. So none of these are structural fixes. They're all regressive fixes back, pushing the responsibility back onto the person, but getting the data to run the deal. And so this is the thing that's kind of interesting to me on the success metrics. And once they securitize the debt, so the money isn't actually in the deal. And that's what I want to make clear. People are like, I don't know how you make money on that. They negotiate a little bit of a profit margin. That's not the real money. The money is that they're going to securitize the debt that is going into it, and then trade that debt. The hedge funds are going to trade that debt. So what they did to mortgage-backed securities, and once removed, they're just gaming it. But you can't gamble if the game doesn't exist. So all of this stuff is just setting up the game on the backs of the poor.
Derivatives.
Yes, it's all derivatives trading. So the thing is, I know that foster care is one of the impact things, and we know, and I'll get to this, but there are real issues with the foster system. Well, so this is saying Pay for Success wants to eliminate, reduce, keep families together. We want to keep families together. But we know that these aren't good people doing this. So, what is the deal? Well, when you're doing derivatives, the reality is there are just as many people out there ready to short it as there are not, right? So this idea that you're going to have a success metric and it's automatically going to lead to a success, if you have good money betting that it's going to fail, it's a sick system, right? But that's the logic of it. We already know, the people who made out really big in the housing situation, they were the people with the big short. They shorted it.
But the only reason why they were able to make money was because the government came in with trillions, hundreds of trillions.
Right, but the people who shorted made the money. The shorter,
they were only able to make the money because of the government bailout.
But the government is all part of the system of keeping it.
The government has a finite amount of money to bail out, these situations.
Well, by that time, the opioid stuff, it's a sick thing. But so I think family separation, speaking to your point, I don't know if you're aware, but so last week, out of city council, they actually did a resolution to investigate child protective services in the city of Philadelphia, which has incredibly high rates of family separation, and a number of highly problematic judges, some of which have been removed, some of which are still in place. This was led by parents and grandparents, and David O was actually the one who advanced this. So this is moving forward. I think it indicates the level of the problem, and that children really as commodities and pawns in this larger game, especially in systems of finance. It's important to know that Cynthia Figueroa, who's the head of Department of Human Services, and really oversees the Child Protective Service Department, she is close colleagues with Nicholas Torres, and they are sort of lead figures in social impact investing in Philadelphia, right? So Cynthia Figueroa is on the board of United Way USA. United Way USA is driving the social impact agenda, the human capital impact agenda, through something called ALICE, which was started in the United Way of Northern New Jersey, interestingly enough. So these folks are both out of Congresso, have past histories, again, not so far from the opioid crisis as it is. So I think it's important to sort of have faces on this, but this is sort of the face of the family separation concern. Just back to foster care briefly. Mentor Network is a for-profit foster care enterprise. Trip Jones was a high-level executive with them for quite some time and then moved on to New Profit, which is one of the key Boston-based initiatives in this.
Privatization in the foster care system.
I know. I mean, and none of this is new. It's just becoming more intense, right? And more automated and more so. And there were kids that, had very bad things happen to them in these systems. But he's since moved on and is now a high level, person with impact investing. I ended up falling into online a group of folks in Scotland. The Annie Casey Foundation is all over Scotland in this ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience Screenings. It's interesting because the folks in Scotland and the Netherlands actually seem to come from a pretty different political viewpoint from me, but they could see what was happening in terms of these really high rates of family breakups and couldn't understand what was happening. Scotland actually had something called a named person law that was put in place to assign a child minder, a well-being of children's, not in the family from birth. And so these minders were part of this whole system of child, and so it was found, the data collection that the minders were doing was found unconstitutional in the Scottish Supreme Court, but they still tried to find a way around it. And then finally, 2 weeks ago, it died. But interestingly enough, ACEs is a huge thing, and I had written a blog post about ACEs, and that's how they found me. But Nadine Burke-Harris, who's the pediatric person that Newsom appointed, head of health in California, and Newsom is pushing all of this screening for trauma. The piece below that is looking at, in Scotland, it was saying, in some council areas, 1 in 10 children were being investigated before they were 4. So really high levels of intrusion into people's family lives. And I guess understanding it's abuse and neglect, that these were not physical abuse situations, but more that families were not able to care for, didn't have adequate resources to take care of their kids. So again, it's criminalizing poverty. And so what are we doing if we have systems that are financialized to actually incentivize children being taken from their families in the name of admitting that they're poor? As soon as you admit that you're housing insecure, you're vulnerable to losing your children. And what does that mean? So locally, in terms of opioids, so the safe injection site that's being proposed, and we would be the first in the U.S. to have one of these injection centers. I think it's really important to know that the model that they're basing it on in Vancouver is framed as an impact investment.
Is what?
It's a social impact investment. When the social impact investors went to Vancouver, they said, look, here, we'll do a bonus site visit field trip to Insight to talk about this, because this is, if you listen to them, it's always about private money. They're like, don't worry, there's no public money going into this. Don't you worry, it's all private money. And it's private money because the opioid, as we had said, pay for success, opioid treatment is an impact sector. It is a sector for finance to make money on data in these evidence-based treatments. So the model in Vancouver is framed as a social impact program and was in 2014 on the tour field trip of all the social impact investors to come check it out. So I think that's, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't have a right to treatment, but I think it should be treatment that is not coercive, and it should be treatment that actually helps them get a stable life. It doesn't just manage them.
It can't be at a public hospital.
Well, I mean, these things are not about the cure. So the other piece of this is that the legal efforts for this site, DLA Piper, they're very much involved in doing pro bono support for pay for success projects. So that's part of the legal firm is very much involved in pay for success. So, and my issue is that if we are going to pursue this is biosensors tracking opioid use. And it appears that there are sensors being developed at local research institutions. Whether or not it's going to be tied to the injection site is a question. But we know that these deals run on data. How are they going to get the data? So I think if we are going to look at this as a treatment option, we have an ethical obligation to publicly have conversations of, if you're in active addiction, are you able to consent to data collection? Like, what are the ethics of that? Because you have to have informed consent for data collection. If you are someone who is in severe, like a heavy user, can you even give that consent to be part of a pay for success deal? And my gut feeling is I would really question if that's something that you could do. But if this is the model, we need to talk about it if we're going to be the national case for this.
But if you're actively using heroin and you desperately need to get high again, and right now in Philadelphia, if you bring in 6 people that you have gotten high with and that you've shot dope with, and they can get all the information from you, then you can get a free some kind of credit card.
Suboxone?
No. You get a credit card for like Target or whatever.
So they're incentivized, yeah.
Yeah, there's already all of these
Systems.
incentives,
Right.
which they would just.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're addicted to heroin, what do you care about a gift card?
Because you sell it. You sell it.
I see.
And then you get the cash in order to shoot dope. And that's why, like, in Kensington, there's all these people that are running around, I won't say the programs, but the programs passing out all of these, shopping cards.
What happens to the people that they dime out?
Huh?
Say they bring in 6 people. What happens to those 6 people?
They end up, according to my inside sources, they end up sharing the dope. Because if you let them know, you get something that you can sell in order to get cash. You can go get high together, but you have to bring in, and the more you bring in,
do they like register
AIDS testing?
I mean, would they get their information, like their name and stuff?
They have to collect the data.
Right. Well, and I mean, the other issue that I have, because I know that they have raised issues of non-heroin users, like users of other substances in that space, and that like, to me, that feels like the charter school situation again. Like, we just want the people in that will make our numbers look good, and if we can manage your issues with a staff that's limited trained and doesn't have more complex medical circumstances, then that's our bottom line. And anyone who's going to have more complicated elements of drug use, we don't want you, because we don't want you to come in and have a problem here and then our numbers go down or our metrics go down. And so I think that there's clearly like issues of race tied in with that, but also I think just in terms of sheer, like, we want to keep like a relatively low skilled, we don't want to hire a hospital level medical care. We just want to have something that will minimally manage people. So, but yeah, I mean, I think these biometric sensors, like, clearly they have them, right? Like, we need to, and yeah, it's a problem. And then the community behavioral health is it says the nation's leader in adapting pay-for-performance systems to the world of behavioral health care. So, as we talk about, in their huge discussions around mental health issues, what kind? Is it innovative with pay-for-performance and teletherapy? So I'm going to go through this a little bit, but this Moneyball government, it's all, pay to play. The Democrats are as much into this as the Republicans, maybe even more so. The conditions of that are assumed austerity, the public-private partnerships, these measurable outcomes. Getting that data involves more tech-mediated solutions. And then where is the data coming from? It's coming from education settings, healthcare settings, and supportive housing settings. So the people who are managing these systems, the service providers, increasingly are deprofessionalized and dehumanized. Increased reliance on machine learning and these coded digital nudges that really just like hard code social control mechanisms, and that this is all feeding global monopoly capital. In Philly, Impact PHL That's the finance piece. The Ben Franklin Technology Partners is the tech piece. A lot of this is tied to benefit corporations, so it's framed as sustainability. Like the whole sustainability movement is sort of a veneer of shade-grown coffee and fair trade textiles on top of essentially a deep, deep and predatory aspect of privatizing the public sphere and everyone who needs...
Predatory.
Yeah. They've had 2 conferences, Total Impact and Good Capital in Philly. There's Judy Wicks right there. She was at one of them. We did a small protest in May when they came back. And the raw material for all of this is ALICE. So ALICE is a concept of the United Way, USA. It stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. So essentially the working poor. So the United Way is anticipating that there will be a permanent underclass of the working poor who will need to access public benefit systems to make it, to continue to live. So that is their raw material. Essentially, it's pushing people into this maze, the Karen program pathway to gamified success, level up so I can get my payment. And, you have all these different versions of Alice. You have disabled, unhoused, incarcerated, addicted.
That's helpful. That screen is very helpful.
Toddlers, underemployed, depressed. You have all these different versions of Alice, but they're all like getting fed into this maze alone. And I think what's really important to think about is that this system of pay for success finance is very much focused on individuals and isolated interventions. It's not structural, and people are treated in an atomized way outside of a larger web of community connection and relationships. So a lot of the things that drive people to addiction are like isolation and trying to live in this neoliberal context, right? And that feeds that. So having these systems that are just treating individuals on dashboards is never going to solve the bigger problem. Mm-hmm. Ideas 42 is about behavioral economics and these digital nudges. If you should look at the Ideas 42 website and all the people who are involved, Angela Duckworth, but it is very much about like using tech to make people make good decisions. And the other screen is from Angela Duckworth's video pitch to the MacArthur Foundation. A number of years ago, MacArthur was going to give $100 million for a global problem. And so they had all these pitch decks, 90-second videos. Angela Duckworth, who is at Penn, she's the GRIT researcher, made a video about using technology to make people make good decisions. Like the world would be so much better if we just all made good decisions, and the technology will help us. She didn't get picked. Actually, who got picked is really depressing. It was Sesame Workshop and International Rescue Committee, because they're pushing AI interventions on Syrian refugee children. And they had a bigger base of test subjects than Duckworth, who are only just going to use New York and Philly public schools. But she later got funded by Mark Zuckerberg. So her research is still continuing with Mark Zuckerberg's money. But Sherry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful, like you had the slide about the different kind of Alices, mm-hmm. right? To have, maybe a slide that then links all the corporations that are benefiting as a result in each of those fields.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I have some little sys map.
Yeah. Project Home and take a picture of their entryway when you walk in the door.
Right.
Because, I'm sorry, it's not in their entryway. It's not like a mural to all the people that have helped save other people. It's all the corporations that have helped build Project Home.
Yeah. No. Well, it's interesting to see who is behind all of the. Johnson & Johnson's a big one. MasterCard. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The other piece of this as we move into the digital is understanding phone-based and digital economics, that these benefits are going to live on phones. And that's why it's so important that we, that they shift everybody, that everybody gets the Obama phones. Mm-hmm. And increasingly this is going to have biometric elements to it. Mm-hmm. Because, let me see, this, you can be nudged in your phone. We have the first behavioral nudge unit at municipal level in the whole world. This started out in the UK, and then with Richard Thaler, and then he brought it to New York with Michael Bloomberg, and then Michael Bloomberg and Michael Nutter brought it here. So we actually have the first municipal level nudge unit. And they're all embedded in the Kenny administration. It was in the managing director's office. So here they're talking about excited to be with the what works cities and how we're all going to be nudged. And the things that they pick as test cases are very hard to fight. So their original nudges are, we want to nudge people so that the elderly take advantage of discounted water rates or something. Or we want to do a nudge so that frontline folks dealing with unhoused people have better customer service. Like those are the two test cases, because how can you be against that, right? Mm-hmm. But then it's not, that here's your biometric sensor so we can track your use of illicit substances. Like they're not going to lead with that. Mm-hmm. So by the time this is all in place. But it's important to know this is a very landmark that we're the first nudge. And it's run by a guy out of Swarthmore because, they're so social justice. This is a great example, I think, of how the mechanics of these digital nudges work within the context of benefits, is that this is the state of Illinois. They're pursuing a full-on scale blockchain identity network. And this is their conceptualization. It hasn't yet been put in place of how you would put your SNAP benefits on blockchain. So each person gets a digital identity that's tied to a benefit wallet. You can see at the top. So their wallet, that's like a Venmo on your phone, credit. And if you buy unhealthy food, it's full price. But if you buy healthy food, the Apple, it'll tick an incentive back into your wallet, and it's verified. This is all, again, Internet of Things, right? It's all through the scan barcode and your scan payment system on your phone. It's all digital. Until the reality is that this, again, is all about the person, not about the system. So this discounts, you may have 3 jobs. You may not have fresh produce you may have it, but it's not open when you can shop. You may not have gas in your house. There are many elements of this that preclude it, and it's an incentive until the amount that they give you only works to the end of the month if you always make the right choice, right? And so you always will have to do the thing to get to the end of the month and maximize your payment. Otherwise, you'll go hungry the last week of the month. So this is actually what they're conceptualizing in the state of Illinois. And this is, again, with bipartisan support, because Rauner brought this out, but now Pritzker is advancing it. And in the state of Illinois, they have a blockchain birth certificate program. So when you're talking about tracking kids and families and data, it's starting early. This is this digital money, again, blockchain money. On the left is this making money smart. They want to put disability benefits on blockchain. So again, that's happening. They're doing digital driver's licenses in Australia. And this is in Singapore. So actual programmable money. We'll give you a voucher, but on blockchain, you can spend X amount on housing, X amount on healthcare, X amount on food, and it's all programmed. You can't move it around. If there's a really good sale on something, you can't move this money into that category. It's all very restricted. And this is my mapping of the smart money blockchain welfare in Australia. But it's interesting because, as you remember, QBE Insurance was an Australian company. And they were investing in the Connecticut Pay for Success. So it's sort of all connected in that you have these... Australia is very big into social impact bonds too. So in New South Wales, you have the social impact bonds. You have digital driver's licenses, which will be these digital identities, and then this programmable money. And then you've got the QBE Insurance here, which is Australian, and the reinvestment fund. So we're starting to see these global systems, because once you have digital money, what's a border? For capital, borders are just for people, not for money. And this I just saw yesterday, which is interesting. This is the Minister of Labor in Australia, who said, if you're at a climate protest, we'll come after you if you're on welfare because you're not working. And so, if we offer you a job, you have to take it. And this is something I've heard in the Netherlands, which is their way of pushing people off the rolls, is they give them a horrific job. But if you don't take the horrific job, then you have no access to anything else, and it's a way of clearing the decks.
Isn't that what Clinton was doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is doubling down, but now imagine if this becomes an automated process and your digital welfare benefits
can be tracked.
Oh, interesting. Is on your phone, right? And there's a sniffer drone that knows everybody's phones who was at the protest, and they can emit and I'm not saying, but technically they could check you against anybody there who's also on welfare and just eliminate your benefit immediately.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is I'm sure they could do it tomorrow if it were. So this is the leading edge. This is something people need to really. And so when we're talking about mutual systems of support that are outside of this welfare state, that's why it's so important. Because we may not have a lot of time to have a backup plan for how to care for each other when these technological systems fully come online. So this is just to close, just to like see some of the people. So this whole global human capital program was set up by Judith Rodin. When she left Penn, she went on to head the Rockefeller Foundation, and at that time, in the lead-in to the housing crisis, she created the Global Impact Investment Network. And what that is like getting everybody on board, because if you're going to play a game, everybody has to be convinced to play the game and that there are common rules. So that's what GIIN said. Because if there's unclear rules, like the people who matter won't play the game. So Global Impact Investment Network is global, largely connected also to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which of the 17, 12 are actually human capital. So it's being run through things that make it much harder to question, because you're like, you must be a climate denier. No, I just am against the UN using their human capital infrastructure to run global capital and put toddlers on surveillance play tables. Thank you very much. But like nobody wants to understand. They just want a meme, you know. So Judith Rodin is a key individual there. For this augmented reality world of techno-fascism to work, like the telecommunications are major players, and clearly Comcast in Philadelphia is the player, right? Like, why did they build that second building? They're going to run our life through it.
I thought they have 3 buildings now.
Well, there's 2 big skyscrapers. There's the one with the pointy finger.
They had a whole show on it like a day ago or something, on highlighting all their
other
properties.
Okay. Well, and again, they're not paying their taxes, right? Because they're getting these taxes.
That's only part of it, that they're not paying their taxes. Is that each building, well, one's $1 billion, one's $1.6 billion, and they expect the only reason why they put any money into these buildings is they expect total reimbursement for every penny.
Yeah.
Of those buildings.
Pay for success.
And profit.
Yeah.
And profit. And the government says, oh, this creates jobs. Well, no, this is a giant ripoff.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, so they were both on the board of the hospital at Penn at the time. So they served on the board together. Yeah. So all of this is also connected very much to chronic illness. And management of chronic illness within a supportive housing construct, within a smart city construct.
Connected to HMOs and insurance,
Medicaid,
and connected to elections.
Right. So this is all in the UK, and I haven't written this yet, but they have a whole thing called social prescribing. So they're like, well, we think you should get out in nature more. You know, like we're going to write you a pay for success prescription for nature, or, you know, meditation or whatever.
That's what I said to my doctor. I said in the middle of the winter, why don't you just write me a prescription for a condo in Florida? You know, and I'm sure you can get statistics showing how that would improve my health.
I think that there's going to be a Black Mirror episode around that, though. Like, then the thing is, you go to the, like, scary carceral state condo, right? With your retinal scan to get you in the door. I mean, like...
Face recognition.
Well, I mean, and that worries me because, right, like, do we want our parks turned into smart parks so that we can, like, log our time walking around the Boxers Trail on our social prescription for our Medicaid access? And that's when people are not thinking about single payer. They don't understand the values-based payment system and blockchain healthcare records and the social prescribing and the pay for success and how Comcast and we're all going to be walking around in radiation from 5G trying to, like, get better. It's just really complicated. So David Cohen, he's in that. Michael Nutter did, like, so much of this. He was the technocrat mayor. Very much close, you know, when he left the city, he went in with Homeland Security and the Federal Reserve and Bloomberg, and so he's the pitch man for the What Works Cities Moneyball government program, and his wife is now an impact investor, Sidecar Social Finance, Lisa. So when he said he was our education mayor,
she sits on the board of Women's Community Revitalization Project that runs the what is it called? That runs the used to run the Affordable Housing Coalition for the city of Philadelphia and fought for the land trust.
Wow. So we really, like, I think that there's really stewing quite a fight around what is shelter? Like people's right to shelter, not surveillance shelter, like not conditional shelter, like that there is an absolute right of people to be able to have a quality housing that is disconnected, a home. And then also, like, I think this is the other piece of this, the tiny house stuff. Like, those are going to be set up as data pods. Like, Intel already has this tiny home situation set up with a retinal scan door and your TV screen that'll have your behavioral therapy and your Nest and your Alexa and all of these elements that really, and it's going to be very isolating. Like, let's just throw up a few of these. And so people need to have bigger conversations around, like, housing within a community of care, like of peers and mutual aid that is disconnected from social welfare. But, okay, I'm almost done. But so Tom Ridge, former Governor Tom Ridge, he is part of this Ridge Lane. They're going to scheme together and put up all of these deals. They're going to make the deals. They have education, sustainability, real estate, and tech are their 4 development areas. So they're the deal makers. They have very high-level military folks involved. They have education. Dr. Haidt used to be on there. I don't know if he still is. Like, after I called him out, he disappeared off the website.
School superintendent?
Yes. So I went to both city council and the school district to say this is totally inappropriate that you're serving a for-profit deal-making company. But it's bipartisan. This is 12 former governors, all bipartisan. And what's scary is Brad Lane is his partner. He's a younger guy. He's doing a fellowship, like like semi-permanent fellowship at Stanford in like behavioral neuroscience stuff. So like, what's he doing over there? Like, that's really intense. And then we have Homeland Security. So there's a lot going on that have ties back here. Kenny, look at that, right? So, like, Comcast is running these social innovation things. Kenny, interestingly enough, a lot of this is going to run on benefit corporations, which are based down in Berwyn. So the Global Impact Investment Network actually has an office in Berwyn. And that's where the B Labs, so the Rockefeller Foundation funded all this stuff. And it's the strangest little building because it's like this dumpy little old railroad building because it's like on the main line. It kind of like when I was out, it was sort of like soggy. It had been raining, and it was with the Exton Dog Show. Like, I walked up and like, so it's like it's one thing to look at it on the internet and think like, oh, but then you actually go to the place, you're like, this is it. Like, it just must be like a computer somewhere in a closet. But it is tied to the main line, and there is this connection between the urban poverty of Philadelphia and the wealth hedge funds of the main line and this dynamic that plays out. But Kenny, like, he was part of setting up these B Labs in the Sustainable Business Network. And this is from the timeline of the B Corp corporate history. It's like, the phone rings and Kenny's going to like do the first legislation for these sustainable businesses, which again, it's not going to be about shade room coffee. It's going to be about privatized public benefit systems. But, I think for the most part, like, Nutter was a pretty sharp policy guy. I don't think Kenny is cut from the same mold, but he's with all the same folks. And so then we also have the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. So a lot of this community development money is run through the Fed. They're doing like all sorts of economic revitalization programs. Harker was a former professor at Wharton for many years and was also on the board of Catholic Relief Services. So when we're talking about when we privatize these public services, the tendency towards them to become embedded in faith-based communities, and especially the Vatican is all in on social impact investing. They've had 3 conferences with Tom Steyer. So that is very much a concern. And again, with the Catholics, so the connection between Pay for Success currently, the federal infrastructure in Philadelphia is through Project Home, and they are running Pay for Success deals in supportive housing. And Mary Scullion, this is the first Total Impact Conference, she gave the welcoming remarks. So this is a room full of like Goldman Sachs suits in there. It was pretty clear what's going on. This is not any kind of effort led by poor folks, and they're giving their blessing on all of this. And this is just one last one. So I think to me, the 2 nodes of the highest level of activity are both in Kensington and North Philadelphia. And that's where the struggle for like land and housing and like access is going to take place. So Omar Woodard briefly ran against Darrell Clark in the 5th District, but he's part of something called the Green Light Fund, and he ran stuff with Obama out in Chester County. So he's tapped into that hedge fund money, and he's working with HUD. So a lot of this is connected to HUD, that new HUD building, $45 million building on Ridge Avenue, and both sort of essentially erasing out through this John Street clearance programs of North Philadelphia displacement through these HUD choice programs. That's probably next going to come to Southwest. And like these neighborhoods that are now in proximity to downtown, there are more attractive assets, are being, the original people who survived all the redlining are being essentially like pushed out and eliminated, and they're flipping all that land over to
The Promise Zone.
Yeah, and this is running. Yeah, this is all the Pay for Success runs through the Promise Zone infrastructure too. Much of this was incubated in the Harlem Children's Zone with Jeffrey Canada and Stanley Druckenmiller and Paul Tudor Jones with the Robin Hood Foundation. So they have a really long lead time. They have like a book of 160 equations about like intervening on poor people's families and like what your financial benefit is. Now Canada's consulting all over the country in the Promise Zones and these opportunity zones. So it really is about real estate and land, and that even getting someone into housing, if what it means is that you're going to be issued a Fitbit and a brainwave monitor, maybe they'll put a chip in your hand and have a drone watching you, like that's something that they could technologically do at this point. And so how do we push back against these systems of incarceration and surveillance before they're fully clamped down, and let people, and how do we parse, like, yes, you need access to housing.
Well, the ACLU said that they don't have the capacity.
Well, one of the key people in Zeta Zone used to work for the California ACLU, so.
Well, I was just saying.
I know, right? So it's on us. But all right.
We
Does
have to
anyone?
ask somebody in the National Lawyers Guild.
All right. Well, I'm gonna close off this for the moment. But thanks, guys.